I'm Dr. Christy Gibson, and this is a part of my book series. I've read many books, a lot of them related to trauma, so I'm going to mention some of the ones that were really important in my learning, perhaps to give you just the basic notes and perhaps to pique your interest. So today we're talking about The Body Bears the Burden by Robert Scaer, and this was a really important book for physicians in particular to learn about trauma because he was working as a physiatrist or a rehab doctor in a whiplash clinic. And what he was noticing is that certain whiplash patients would have PTSD. And what he's examining in this book is, well, who are those patients and what does that response look like? So for me, it was a really great physiological or body-based introduction to trauma. So in some of my other book reviews, I talk about a psychological introduction through Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, and this was my physical introduction. So I'll describe to you what I took away from this book. First, by starting on page 9, which is where he has a diagram of all of the different brain, I'll see if I can get this closer to you, the different brain areas that are responsible for the trauma reflexes. And so some of the key ones, we've heard about the amygdala. So think of that as like the smoke detector of the brain. It's deciding if you are safe or if you are in danger. So the amygdala is one of the places that can set up a reflex. So it's going to tell your body to go into fight and flight if it thinks you're in danger. Interestingly, he also talks about the locus coeruleus, which I think of as another place where that subconscious reflexive response can happen. And both of these are really important once I started studying different kinds of trauma therapy, because within the locus coeruleus, that's where some of the brain spotting, deep brain reorienting fits in around the orienting reflex, or where is your head and kind of muscles positioned at the time of the trauma. And the amygdala can store the traumatic associations. So it doesn't store the regular memories, it stores the emotions, the physical sensations, and the triggering context associated with the memory. So he differentiates the amygdala storing these associations versus the hippocampus, which stores the facts. And that comes into play in one of his later chapters. He'll talk about the orbitofrontal cortex. So I talk about the prefrontal cortex, but that's really where your thinking brain happens. Executive functioning, decision-making skills, coordination, and this actually is not really in charge of the trauma response until later. If the response gets past the amygdalas, then the frontal cortex gets involved. So that's also important because to me, it means you can't think your way out of one of those automated trauma responses. Interestingly, too, is all the sensory input gets routed through the thalamus, except for your sense of smell. So that's why that can be a quicker trigger for some folks where it really doesn't enter the thinking brain. Another important piece of the neurobiology for me was his differentiator between the different kinds of memory. So this is on page 34, where he talks about declarative or explicit memory. And these are the facts that you learn. And so you might learn them through what he calls semantic, or you're learning from somebody else, or he also describes episodic learning. So that is something that is a fact that we have learned. And this is like formal education. So when you're learning from a teacher, where you're learning from a parent, and you're gathering information and data. And he describes this as quite fragile. If it's not applied or if it's not relearned constantly, it can be lost, easily lost in dementia conditions. And he also describes this as something that is stored in the hippocampus area, differentiating from where non-declarative or implicit memory is stored. So these are skills, conditioned responses, and emotional associations. So I describe the emotional associations being kind of in that amygdala storage area to keep you safe. And these other procedural memories. So think of like, do you actively have to think of how to walk or how to eat or how to drive a car? I mean, if you're learning, absolutely, but at some point it just becomes like procedural memory. So false procedural memory is at the core of trauma. And so this is his kind of key hypothesis. So these are stored in a totally different way. So the facts that you have are stored differently than traumatic memories. So he also talks about if stimuli represent a life-threatening event, the conditioned response may appear and never be extinguished. So that's different than the declarative memory where you have to kind of relearn something until it really sinks in. Whereas if something is life-threatening, you learn that once and then you have a conditioned response. So this is what I think of as a reflex, and why I love to say that the body is such a great doorway into trauma recovery, because when you have a conditioned response, it's not entering conscious awareness, it's not stored in declarative memory as fact, and so it's hard to use certain cognitive techniques right away until you're dealing with the hippocampus and the facts. So another piece of neuroanatomy that he has another great diagram of is the autonomic nervous system in trauma. So he talks about oscillatory systems, or ups and down waves, or pendulation. A lot of folks use diagrams similar to this to talk about being outside of your window of tolerance, overactive and underactive nervous system responses. And so he talks about this as avoidance symptoms, things like isolation, substance use, constricted affect, shame and withdrawal. And so that would be in differentiated from the sympathetic or the more activated response. So this is hyperarousal, release of endogenous opioids, exaggerated autonomic cycling. So he does differentiate between those two responses. One of the last kind of physiologic or body-based responses to trauma that I learned about in this book that was really applicable to me working in refugee health, because this is a very common response, is somatization. So somatization means that you have a psychological condition, but it is being expressed through body-based symptoms. So one of the things I see lots in refugee health is a headache or abdominal pain as a way to express psychological suffering. So he talks about gastrointestinal, genitourinary, so stomach, intestines, bladder, a lifetime of surgical procedures in which no pathology is found. But like, if you think about the way the body is set up, your nervous system is going everywhere. All of these systems are deeply interconnected. So you could have a brain-based experience that is expressed or even experienced by the body as something physical. And that's something that I see quite often. So that was really helpful for me. And he says that they can't express emotion other than through the physical symptoms, but they can be traumatized by the denial of validating that. Key important factor, and I see this a lot in complex trauma, is folks will have all kinds of what the medical system causes functional disorders, and then we add medical trauma to that because we're not validating their form of expression of their suffering. So learning about the neurophysiology and the medical end of trauma, the body bears the burden.